This is the Open University.
You find me back in Berlin and experiencing winter for the first time in quite a while, because last year me and Naomi took off and did a sort of tour of Europe, which ended up in Athens, and I ended up spending 8 months in Athens and recording an album there called Athenian. This year we sort of got restless at about the same time and headed first to Brussels and then down south into Spain, right down to the very south coast of Spain, where you could sort of see Africa on a clear day, and then back up into Italy, and we saw the Venice Biennale, which is kind of where I left you in last month's episode of the Open University. So I wanted to just catch up with some of the adventures since then, which have involved, as predicted, a week or so in Prague. That's where we headed after Venice. And of course the train up through the Alps is amazingly spectacular. You go up through some amazing scenery, and you get to Innsbruck, which is where we decided to spend the night. And that evening the sunset was gorgeous. The mountains are an amazing backdrop to Innsbruck. It's a kind of little town nestled in the Alps, and we stumbled across the Taxis Palais Kunsthalle, which is a nifty little 4-room museum with a little art library and a graphic design room as well, where they had sort of, this photograph of a brutalist building was part of the exhibition we saw there. Nobody else was in there. As last year, what happened as we moved through these countries was a lot of them went down into lockdown just as we were leaving or just after we left. So actually, I think you couldn't go into this museum now. If you went to Innsbruck, it would be closed because of COVID. The other thing that was kind of following us, apart from COVID snapping at our heels, was national holidays. And we'd experienced one in Madrid in the middle of October, which was the Hispanic Day, a national holiday commemorating the date when Christopher Columbus first set foot in the Americas. I'm not sure if they still claim that they discovered America, because of course the Vikings and various Irish monks discovered America in coracles, as we know. But this is when they Hispanized America, I guess. So they were celebrating that, and the irony is that all these national holidays happen in the same way. They send a few jets over, they have some military parades. We were unfortunate enough to have to run into one in Vienna when we reached Vienna the day after Innsbruck. On October the 26th every year, Austrians celebrate their country's declaration of permanent neutrality after World War II, and Austria's regained status as an independent and sovereign nation. So it just strikes me as odd that this also involved jets thundering across the sky. And we, of course, took refuge, went and sheltered in the Secession, which was at the time showing Dan Vo, who's a Vietnamese born but brought up in Denmark and living in Berlin artist. And what else did we do in Vienna? We went to the Café Sperl and ate their breakfast and drank their coffee, which is all very 19th century. And I was it wasn't the cafe that Karl Kraus used to go to, but I was sort of thinking myself into the mind of Karl Kraus as I sat there. Chanamar Tea House, which is I usually go to as well, just off the Nachtmarkt, that was closed due to COVID, I guess. So we went instead to a place called Mary's Mecha Matcha, which was a kind of bubble pearl tea place. Here we are in the Secession looking at the Secession founders' work. Of course, this was founded by Gustav Klimt and some other artists in 1900. I've got work in the Secession archives because they have an exhibition called Six Sessions, which I was part of. They filmed a concert I played in the basement of the Secession, and it's part of their archive. And so then we beat a hasty retreat to Prague. And Prague, beautiful sunny weather. We were staying in a very charming rundown hotel called the Arbs Hotel. And we went up, first of all, to see the Kafka Museum. We'd taken like 5 days in Prague, so, because I knew there was a lot to do there. And it's also very cheap. It's very reasonably priced in Prague, even more so than Vienna. We looked at in the Cafe Arco. I always like seeing the presence of Kafka there, because Kafka's my favorite writer of all time, and here he is posing in front of the Cafe Arco, which was where he read a lot of his pieces out loud, apparently giggling a lot. He had a real sense of humor about his interrogations of the post-colonial Habsburg Empire state and its repressive tactics. But the Kafka Museum is oddly authoritarian. You're only allowed to go through it in one prescribed path, and people are kind of breathing down your neck the whole time, security guards and things. This is something we found quite a lot. Some museums are getting very authoritarian and have rather bad-tempered guards and people talking into loud radios all the time when you're trying to look at the art. The other places we liked in Prague, the Miners' Cafe and Characters, it's called, in Vinohrady area. That's a very elegant, minimalist cafe with some austere and proudly aloof waitresses, I noticed there. They certainly weren't welcoming us, but they were doing things right in terms of what they were, making to eat and drink. We went to actually a really nice little cafe called Bistro 8 in Prague 7 after visiting the castle. We went to the Museum Kampa, which had an exhibition of Kupka, František Kupka, who's often matched with Kafka because their names sound quite similar, and there is a sort of strange idol imagery, which Lovecraftian kind of imagery, actually probably more Lovecraftian than Kafkaesque, but because they were kind of contemporaries, Kupka often illustrates, say, the Penguin Modern Classics edition of Description of a Struggle and Other Stories, has a Kupka on the front. And also in the Kampa Museum, they had a Jiří Salomon exhibition. He's famous as an animator in that sort of 60s charming Czech style that we know so well. Krtek the Mole, for instance, is not by him, but it's kind of this similar period and similar quirky, humorous style. He's famous more for Fig the Giant Dog, and thank God Fig the Giant Dog does not claim to be interrogating post-colonial life. He's just a talking dog, We also looked at the Docks Centre for Contemporary Art, which has a giant blimp on the ceiling now, a thing called the Gulliver Airship, which is kind of fun to explore and where they have live events. And we looked at the Ethnographic Museum of the National Museum, which is, it's kind of an ethnographic take on their own culture. So it's about their own white Bohemian culture. What else did we look at? We looked at and enjoyed the Botanical Gardens of Charles University. And we visited Kauri. I have several friends who moved from Berlin, sometimes by complicated routes via America, but they moved from Berlin to Prague. Essentially, Prague became for them the new Berlin, a cheaper and more genuinely Bohemian Berlin, perhaps. So a lot of those people have now moved out to the countryside and have families and things. So it wasn't possible to see them all, but I did see Kauri kind of dividing her time like me between Prague and France, where she has a French partner now. And she's renting an apartment right under the castle, in the shadow of the castle in the old touristic old town around the bottom of the castle. So that was really interesting to meet up with her. We also found this amazing second-hand clothes shop called 1981 Secondhand in Prague 2, the second district, which is a weird district. Reminded me a bit of Dumbo because it's in New York, because it's sort of dominated by a huge bridge, monstrous bridge carrying traffic across a kind of valley, and various parks and things around there. Apart from 1981 Secondhand, not very much happening in that district, but this was an amazingly curated shop that we bought the hell out of it. I mean, there was so many good shirts and sweaters and things like that. So that was Prague, and the underground, the overground, the views over the city. We were blessed with very great weather. There are always strange TV towers in Czech cities or just in the middle of the countryside. There are these futuristic communist era TV towers everywhere, and then this architecture, which is sort of 19th century and always reminds you of Kafka stories and things. So then it was back to Berlin and the VU store, which is a very chic, expensive shop in Kreuzberg, Humana, which is where I tend to buy my sweaters and things, Do You Read Me, Kunstwerk, where they have currently an exhibition with an artist called Renee Green. The thrust of her work is really to look at the colonial situation, or the slavery rather, and colonialism. Ultimately, another guilty prod at the underbelly of a society which probably doesn't, outside of its cultured guilty classes, guilty bourgeois classes, probably doesn't care very much about the issues being discussed because it's historical. What was very interesting was to see the new the Dahlem Ethnographic Museum, which I used to go to regularly out in Dahlem, an amazing kind of hidden gem of Berlin, which tourists didn't know about because it was such a long train trip out to the campus of the Free International University to see this sort of 1960s era building, which was filled up with, the looted gems of precisely the colonial period. You'd see all these Pacific rafts, hand-built rafts, or you'd see African artifacts and Eskimo, sealskin anoraks and just amazing things. There was also a great Asian and musicological department. So this has all been relocated now to the Humboldt Forum, which is, when they demolished the old communist East German government building, the People's Palace, they rebuilt the 18th century palace very controversially and very expensively, which had been on the site before and had been, I guess, bombed into the ground by my compatriots, the RAF, in the Second World War. And so they rebuilt this in a slightly weird, fake way, a fake kind of 18th century architecture with a modern facade on one side, and then these sort of fake domes and statues and things which have all been reconstructed according to what they see in photographs of how the old building was. And it's a weirdly triumphalist statement architecturally, and yet the exhibitions, certainly in the Ethnographic Museum, are very apologetic. There's a lot of didactic video and text about how when these things were collected, they didn't collect the names of the individual artists who made them. They're not going to restore them because there aren't the facilities, in these various countries in Africa and elsewhere to restore them. But also they've recruited African academics to say that it's more useful to them to have all this stuff on site in one place in Berlin where they can come and look at it, under nice conditions. Actually, the conditions were not that nice because this museum was full of glitches, a bit like the Berlin airport, which took so long, ran over budget and over time by years, because they kept the security systems didn't really interact with each other. They had to redo all the electrical wiring and the fire alarms and everything. Our experience of this new ethnographic museum, which had been so charming out at Dahlem in its brutalist 60s building, in the Humboldt Forum, there were sirens going off in every single room. And there were security guards kind of a little bit menacing in every single room. And I was even, when I went to a toilet, I had to use a disabled toilet because the main one was out of order. Apparently there was a sign on the door. I went in and there was a siren going off in the disabled toilet. And when I stepped out of the disabled toilet, there was a guard facing me. So it's just kind of, full of this kind of atmosphere of simultaneous menace and apology. The curators and the people making the official facade of this culture make a very humanistic, apologetic, enlightened shape. But then right beside them are standing these guys dressed in black with sort of jackboots on and walkie-talkies, and they're checking your COVID passes all the time. They're checking that you're not misbehaving. They're checking you're going the correct prescribed route around their museums. So it's kind of a weird combination of bungling, authoritarianism, and guilt, which is really the flavor left on my tongue anyway from some of these visits and some of these experiences. What else did we do in Berlin? Went to Do You Read Me, which is glossy magazines. God knows they're suffering just now. Not so many people believe in that glossy lifestyle, I think, because of the last couple of years. Kunstwerk, René Green, I mentioned already. The Saalbau Gallery, the Corner Park Gallery, these are Neukölln galleries. We saw an exhibition called Sandstorm, and then there was Dust at the Corner Park Gallery, which is sort of focused on the Middle East. The Alta Museum had a thing about ethnomusicography. What did Greek music sound like? What did ancient Greek music sound like? And that's something particularly close to my heart. Although actually, in terms of answering that question, there was just one room really to try and answer that, and it was mostly a video which you could have watched on YouTube. The sort of discovery of this couple of weeks of Naomi and my life in Berlin was, our favorite discovery was a new Korean cafe in Prenzlauer Berg called Li Pang, which is a very cozy little new cafe, a few months old, run by a Korean woman, beautifully decorated in a kind of retro 70s style. We also ended up going to Kambai for tea quite a lot, bubble tea, to Smart Delhi, which I used to go to in the first decade of this century when I lived in Berlin before. It's run by Yumi and used to be in Friedrichshain, but it's now in Mitte. We also visited with Justin and Misaki. Justin and Misaki Kawai and their daughter Poco were in town. They live in Copenhagen now. Misaki Kawai, of course, did the sleeves for Hypnoprism and Bibliotech, my albums. And we took them to Motto, the art book store, and a place called Café Panda on the Lausitzerplatz, which is, it's very spicy. It had the right kind of decor, sort of nice kitschy decor, but the food was a little bit too spicy for my taste anyway. And we also met up with Edgars Gluhovs, who's an artist friend of mine, and with my Malaysian friend Liana. We took her to the Korean cafe, and what else? Went out to explore slightly further flung Berlin sites like the Dong Huan Center, the Vietnamese trading warehouses out in the east, and looked around IKEA, of course, the IKEA in Lichtenberg, and there was a huge fun fair right next to that, so that's quite interesting, and a huge Hofner shop as well, which is a kind of German furniture shop, not as good as IKEA. And actually, my favorite exhibition was a thing called Countergravity, the films of Heinz Emmigholz at Haus der Kultur in der Welt. Heinz Emmigholz, a huge hero of mine, he started off in the 70s making quite weird structuralist films, but then later he focused on structure itself in terms of architecture and just filmed buildings. So he made films about Goff and Loos and all these architectural figures, and just looked at their buildings or the buildings they endorsed in very long takes with excellent sound, just the sound of what the buildings are like, or the Nutra projects, for instance, in California. Just looking at classic modernist design in this very detached way. So it's ideal to see in an exhibition where you can just sort of settle back on a chair and watch excerpts from all his films of this century. He's also worked with Kreidler, making a film about Kreidler in Tbilisi, the band that I've worked with as well. My friend Andreas is in Kreidler, and they worked with Heinz Emmigholz on some videos. And the Café Krenzler, another place we went, Mamicha, the gallery Narochitan, which is in Mitte, the Times Art Center, which is a kind of Chinese propaganda gallery, but it usually has some interesting stuff about Chinese identity and etc. And the Battalion Center has just as usual 3 artist show. The Kunstraum Kreuzberg has a show called Landscapes of Liberation, Freistaat Barakia, which takes the history of Barakia. It was an independent free state founded in the 1870s by migrant workers in Berlin and the disenfranchised urban dwellers in Kreuzberg, and takes that as a starting point to explore, wouldn't you know it, decolonial urbanism, resistance, and solidarities. Around about the same time as, I guess, the Paris Commune. So it's like a sort of mini Berlin version of perhaps even inspired by the Paris Commune. Although, of course, it was the Germans, the mainstream Germans, who were surrounding the Paris Commune and finally destroyed it. Destroyed its resistance, urbanism, and solidarity. And that takes us pretty much up to the present. And hope you've enjoyed this little talk, and see you next time.
Open University.